Hey everybody, this is Angela. Welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. Hope everybody's having a really good Friday. And I thought that we would get back to who was Jane Austen. And I think we got, let's see, one, two, three. We got three more chapters. Let's get into it. Who was Jane Austen? Chapter 7, Independence. Although selling her manuscript gave Jane new energy to keep writing, family members became much more important. Reverend Austen had not been well since the family moved to Bath at the end of 1804, and early in 1805, Jane's father fell ill once again. The family sent for a doctor, but he could not help Jane's father. Reverend Austen died on January 21st, 1805. Jane, her mother, and her sister were very sad about the death of Reverend Austen. They were now also worried about their own futures. According to the customs of the time, James, the eldest son, would inherit his father's estate. The Austen women had no money of their own. They would have to rely on the generosity of Jane's brothers, and they could not continue living in Bath. For the next year, Jane, Cassandra, and their mother moved from place to place. They stayed with family and friends who were kind enough to take them in. They visited James and Mary in Stephenson, Edward and Elizabeth in Gotham, and Francis and his new wife, Mary, in Southampton. Jane was glad to leave Bath behind, but she was frustrated by this kind of life. She was constantly packing and unpacking her bags. She was not able to write. Jane wanted a place to call home. She wanted a place where she could write. Edward's wife Elizabeth died in October 1808 after giving birth to their 11th child. Cassandra had come to help with the birth, and she stayed on at Gotham to help run the house after Elizabeth died. Even with Cassandra's help, Edward struggled to look after all his children, so he sent two of his sons to visit their Aunt Jane at Francis and Mary's house in Southampton. The young boys were grief-stricken at the loss of their mother, but Jane kept them busy and made sure they had plenty to do. She played games with them, took them to see a battleship being built, floated paper boats on the river. She made up riddles to entertain them. Edward had not given his mother and sisters much money when Reverend Austen died, but Jane's kindness to his sons changed his mind. He gave them something they hadn't had since they left Stephenson, almost 9 years earlier, a home of their own. Edward offered his mother and sisters the choice of two properties he had inherited from the knights. One was near Gotham, the other was in the village of Chawton in the beautiful countryside of Hampshire. The women chose the house in Chawton. Mrs. Austen and her daughters felt a huge sense of relief. They would no longer have to depend on their relatives for a place to stay. They would have their own home in the country. It would provide Jane with the peace and quiet she needed to write. She would have her own room where she could continue to work. It had now almost been 6 years since her brother had sold the rights to Susan to Richard Crosby. Jane wrote to him saying that if she didn't hear back, she would send the manuscript to another publisher. because Mr. Crosby had never known the author's name. Jane called herself Mrs. Ashton Dennis. She would only initial and sign the letter MAD. Richard Crosby wrote back to say that he would return the manuscript to her if she repaid the money he paid for it, but Jane no longer had it. What money she had left was spent paying the household bills, so Jane was unable to buy back the manuscript. Her novel remained unpublished but owned by Richard Crosby. Chapter 8. Success at Last. Jane's new home in Chalverton was a red brick two-story building. It had been built in the 1700s. Many coaches used to travel between London and Southampton. It had 6 bedrooms, 2 parlors, attic rooms called garrets that could be used for storage or as a bedroom for servants. The Chalverton house also had a large garden with fruit trees, vegetables, flowers, and a pond. Jane and her mother were the first to move into the house in July 1809. Shortly after moving in, Jane wrote a note to her brother Frank. Our Chalverton home has how much we find already into our minds, and how convinced that when complete it will all other houses beat that ever have been made or mended, with rooms constant or rooms distant. You'll find us very snug next year. Jane was now 33. She had accepted the fact she would probably never get married. She also accepted the fact that her novel Susan never be published, but Jane was happier than she's ever been in a long time. The new home was comfortable, and it was in the countryside that Jane loved so much. There were lots of paths and trails. Jane took walks and thought about revising the novel she had already written, and she was inspired with ideas for new books. Life in Charleston fell into a routine for Jane, and it was a routine she enjoyed. She woke up and practiced the piano before making breakfast for everyone. She would then sew or embroider and make shopping trips to the village. She played with her nieces and nephews when they visit, all 17 of them. Jane also continued to write. She had a small writing desk in the parlor where the piano was. During 1809 and 1810, Jane decided to revise Sense and Sensibility. Once she was happy with it, Jane sent the manuscript to a different publisher, Thomas Egerton. He liked the book, but he did not want to take the risk on an unknown writer, especially a woman. Egerton told Jane that he would publish the book if she paid the cost of printing it herself. Jane was determined to see one of her books published. Her brother Henry knew how important this was to Jane, so he and his wife Eliza agreed to pay for Sense and Sensibility to be printed. It took a long time for a book to be published in the 1800s. The type was put in place letter by letter, and the paper press was turned by hand. The printing began in April, but the book did not appear in stores until October of 1811 because it was not considered proper for women to earn money by writing. Jane's name didn't appear in the book. The author was listed simply as a lady, but that didn't bother Jane. Finally, one of her stories would be read by more people than just her family. Sense and Sensibility received good reviews. Once said One said the author had much knowledge of character and a great deal of good sense. Another said the book was well written, highly pleasing and interesting. Excuse me. Highly pleasing, interesting, with an entertaining narrative. They praised the unknown author's story about Eleanor and Marianne's struggle to find love as the events of their lives unfolded around them. By July 1813, every printed copy of Sense and Sensibility had been sold. Jane earned what would be nearly 15,000 in today's money. Excuse me. Because Sense and Sensibility had done so well, Thomas Egerton offered to publish Jane's next book. She had the manuscript for First Impressions ready for him, but a book had already been published with that title. Jane remembered one of her favorite lines from Cecilia by Fanny Burney, and she called her new book Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Everton paid Jane more than 10 times what Richard Crosby had paid for Susan. Pride and Prejudice was published in January of 1813. Once again, the title page didn't reveal Jane's name. It read only by the author of Sense and Sensibility. The book was so popular that a second printing was scheduled for later that same year. Finally, Jane's writings was being taken seriously. Her next book was called Mansfield Park. James finished writing it in July of 1813 and it was published in May of 1814. Mansfield Park was written when Jane was 37 years old. Although she was still writing about the drama surrounding the search for the right husband, Jane now looked at marriage as serious business. Her writing was much less comical. Because Mansfield Park was more serious than her other books, the main character is plain and shy. Mr. Egerton was worried that it wouldn't sell as well, so he had made the same deal with Henry Austen as he had for Jane's first novel. He agreed to publish the book as long as Jane paid for the printing costs. Jane confidently agreed. She felt that readers connected with the honest stories she told, and she hoped that this book would be a success, would be as successful as her first two have been. Chapter 9. The Words Live On. While the manuscript for Mansfield Park was being set at the printers, Jane began her fourth novel, Emma. The story of Emma was funny and light-hearted, more in the style of her first two books. Jane said she wanted to create a strong female character whom no one but myself will much like. The book focuses on Emma's attempt at matchmaking, setting her friends up on dates which all end in disaster. Mansfield Park was a success, and the first printing sold out within 6 months. More money than she had ever earned before, but Mr. Egerton refused to reprint the book. This upset Henry Austen because no one knew that Jane was the author. Her brother Henry contacted another publisher on Jane's behalf. He sold Emma to John Murray in December of 1815. Mr. Murray also bought the rights to publish Mansfield Park and Sense and Sensibility. Henry became ill in November, and Jane stayed with him while he recovered. One of the doctors who came to visit Henry was the personal physician to the Prince of Wales, the son of King George III, and the heir to the throne of England. While treating Henry, the doctor told Jane that the Prince of Wales enjoyed reading her books. Jane was invited to visit the Prince's library at Carlton House in London. While she was there, the librarian suggested that she dedicated her next book to the Prince. Jane was shocked by this request. The Prince was known for his selfishness and sometimes scandalous behavior. Jane did not want to mention him in her book, but Jane's family told her that she could not turn down this request. Dedicating her book to the Prince might help sell more copies, so Jane agreed and dedicated Emma to the Prince of Wales. She also presented him with a special red letter bound copy. Most critics agreed that Emma was Jane's best book yet. Sir Walter Scott, a famous author at that time, said that Emma was a great example of a new style of novel that showed ordinary people in everyday life. But there was still one manuscript of Jane's that had not been published, so Jane asked Henry to get in touch with Richard Crosby and buy back the rights to Susan. It had been 13 years since he had paid so little for the manuscript he never published. Once Henry made the deal, he told the publisher that Susan, by the same author of the very successful books Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, and Emma, Mr. Crosby had passed up a very big opportunity. While she was writing her next book, Jane began to feel ill. She and Cassandra traveled to a spa, hoping that the rest in warm water might help with Jane's fever and the pain in her back. When they returned home to Charlton, Jane finished the first draft of her latest manuscript. There were parts she wanted to revise, but before she did, she decided to go back and once again work on Susan. As the year went on, Jane began to feel better. She finished Susan and retitled it Northanger Abbey, and she finished her new manuscript, which she called Persuasion. But not long into the new year of 1817, Jane's fever and pain returned. It became too difficult for Jane to work, so she put her writing aside. Jane tried to hide her illness. She joked about it in letters to her family, but she probably took it seriously enough to write her will in April of 1870. She wanted to leave small gifts to her brother Henry and his housekeeper. Everything else she would leave to her dearest sister Cassandra. In May, Jane went to visit a new doctor, but it was clear there was not much that could be done for her. Although she was growing weaker, Jane continued to have visitors and write letters to friends and family. On July 18, 1817, at the age of 41, Jane Austen died. Cassandra was at her bedside. 6 days later, Jane was buried in Winchester Cathedral, the city's ancient historic church. Jane's family knew how much her novels meant to her. After her death, they made sure that both Northanger Abbey and Persuasion was published. For the first time, Jane's name appeared as the author of her books. In 1869, her nephew James Edward Austen Leigh published a memoir of Jane Austen. The memoir introduced all 6 of Jane's novels to a much larger audience. 52 years after her death, Jane Austen's writings was once again as popular as ever. Jane's juvenile notebooks still exist. One is in the Baldwin Library in Oxford, England, and the other 2 are in the British Museum in London. And her work lives on in countless adaptations, movies, television shows, and new versions of her beloved stories. Jane Austen's accomplishments what she set out to do. She achieved successfully as published author in a time when it was very uncommon for women to even dream of having careers. Although she was not famous during her lifetime, her novels have rarely been out of print since then. And in 2013, the Bank of England announced that Jane Austen will be the first woman whose portrait will appear on British money. In addition to Jane's face, the 10-pound banknote will feature the following quotes: "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." And that's the end of Who Was Jane Austen. I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading it and learning about her and everything. And I have 4 of her novels, and I need the other 2. And you know, here's the thing: at that time, women could not have careers, and they would not, whatsoever let them be a publisher unless you went by another name that sounded like a man. So, I'm glad that her novels are still being printed. I love her movies. I've seen Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility and Persuasion. Really good movies. And, check out her novels. Go to the libraries if you can and check out her books. They are really good. They're wonderful books, decent, wonderful books. I think you would really like them. So please hit like and subscribe to my channel. Please hit the notification bell so you'll know when I come out with a new video. And I hope you all have a really good afternoon. Good night.